Don grew up on the island of Hawaii. Although as a Stanford undergraduate, his professors encouraged him to attempt a career as a writer, he went to Harvard for anthropology, for a PhD instead. As a graduate student professor at Buff State, he specialized in ecological anthropology, but in the mid-90s, he turned his attention to the emerging field of humanistic anthropology, winning the Society for Humanistic Anthropology's Poetry and Fiction Prize. See how he gets all these things moving in the same direction together. Along the way, he's been a photographer, marathoner, ultramarathoner, professional road race timer, computer programmer, and renovator of old houses. His poetry, fiction, and photographs have appeared in Humanistic Anthropology, Green Mountains Review, New Millennium Writings, Discover, Boston Phoenix, and elsewhere. His story, Dog Food, was nominated for Pushcart Prize, and Flip Pivot won second prize in the Millennium Writings Competition. Much of his work is based on years of living among the Nakavisi people of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. Probably didn't say any of that right. He's working on a novel set on the island during its brutal decade-long secessionist war. He divides his time between Colden and Hawaii. You please welcome Don Mitchell.
Thank you, Ricky. And thank you for letting me do this, too, because I haven't ever done it before, except in my living room. You're going to be hearing a single extended piece that's written in the second person and is accompanied by images. There will be sections in which the screen is black with no images at all, and the images will be more or less synchronized to what I'm saying, but not precisely because it isn't possible. I did toy with the idea of making the whole thing in the studio and bringing it in and lip syncing. This is called Queen of the Night, and you're slashing Hawaiian vegetation with a crocodile machete. The brand Solomon Islanders call puk puk, and it's all coming back to you. You're in a patch of your dead mother's yard, 100 feet by maybe 50, right at the end of the driveway. From your childhood, you remember monstera, cordyline, cestrum nocturnum, and an ornamental plant you can no longer name. It's all covered by creepers and a sullen dark green vine you don't recognize. Everything's growing wildly in clumps and heaps because nobody's cared for this patch since your father died. At first, your body didn't remember how to do this, but after an hour you've loosened up. You have to hack and slash and pull away the overgrowth before you can see the structure underneath. Then, maybe in the late afternoon, you can start the fine work. A rooster crows next door. There aren't very many cars on the road that runs beside your mother's house, and the Wailuku River is up because of the rain last night. You can hear it plainly. Your arm goes over your head. You smell your sweat. And that opens the gate to other odors. You realize with pleasure, delight really, that the combination of slashing and heat and the saps and juices on you and the close quarters of the area you're cleaning have made you smell like you used to in Nagovisi on Bougainville, thousands of miles from here. The sounds were already with you, your motor memory is returning, and now with the smells you can believe that you're working in a Solomon's garden, maybe your favorite, Wanaonami. You start imagining that when you're done, you'll walk back to the village, laden with food, a small child on your shoulders. And after you go to the river and wash, you can sit with somebody you like and chew a little betel and talk about things that might turn out to be interesting. If you were in the village, you could tell how you spotted a puk puk in the Hilo Farmers Exchange, the store where, in the 50s, your mother bought a wooden-handled castrating knife, which she used to cut and shape tree fern for her orchids. When you lost your Boy Scout knife, she gave it to you. You carved your name in the handle, and you still have it. The blade no longer gracefully curved, instead straight tapered like a dagger from half a century of the whetstone. You had it in your pocket when you landed in 7 degrees south, near the weather coast of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, from where it's just been reported that Harold KK has indeed killed 6 Anglican brothers. You were there in 1968 in the company of Malaytons, a people you came to know and like, a people who, 30-odd years later, created the Malayton Eagle Front and started fighting Harold KK and his Isatabu Liberation Front. You landed at a Guadalcanal airfield, then went to the Lieber brothers' coconut plantation near the mouth of the Lunga River, where a quarter century before the Marines had landed, almost unopposed. Coconut palms take small arms and light machine gun fire very well, and the Japanese could not displace the Marines from their plantation lines, though there was much killing. In 1968, there were still coils of barbed wire on the beach, and you picked a yellow hibiscus and placed it in the center of one and photographed it. You showed the slide dozens of times, and no one ever asked you how the flower had gotten itself in the middle of a coil of barbed wire. This was the summer of Chicago, which you'd been hearing about on shortwave radio. Rioting in Chicago hadn't made you photograph the wire, the landing mat, the rusted out tanks, the gun emplacements, but it might have had something to do with the flower. So here you are, slashing vegetation with your puk-puk and thinking about Harold KK's killings. You read about it in the Honolulu newspaper that's flown to Hilo in the pre-dawn darkness, and you've seen postings about it on the internet. You cannot understand what could have made Harold KK kill first one Anglican brother and then kill the 6 others who came to see if their brother was dead and to take away his body if he was. You're still chewing on this because it makes no sense to you. The lunatic, charismatic leaders in the Solomons you know about show great respect for religious people. The last time you went to Bougainville and worried about encountering juiced-up young fighters who might be hostile to white strangers, you were advised to start out by saying, "I greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." And you decided that if it came to a test between your beliefs and your life, that you would betray your beliefs and declare that Jesus Christ was your personal Savior. You don't understand what Harold KK and the Isatabu Liberation Front wanted, except for Malaytons to get out of Guadalcanal and go back to Malaya across the channel called Iron Bottom Sound because of the many American and Japanese vessels sunk there. He wanted the Malaytons to stay on their largely Protestant and pagan island and worship bush spirits and trap porpoises and make strands of the red shell money they had been trading up the Solomons for centuries, and leave Guadalcanal and its capital, Honiara, to him. In 1968, you crossed Iron Bottom Sound in a small boat piloted by Malaytons on your way to the Lao Lagoon. The senior researchers you were working with flew across in a light plane, but you, the graduate student, had to go on the boat and look after the equipment. You had no idea what awaited you in the Lao Lagoon, except that it would be interesting and probably difficult. You did not know you would discover something about yourself there, and that 35 years later, you'd be thinking about it while slashing vegetation in your dead mother's yard in Hawaii. You discovered powers of endurance you didn't know you had. After a few days of work, tubes of blood had to be shipped to Australia, so you and some Malaytons paddled to a roadhead before dawn in a dugout canoe named Ringing Bell. But the Land Rover that should have met you was not there. You pulled on your brown plastic Chinese sandals and then pulled them off because they stuck in the mud and you were more comfortable in bare feet anyway, and walked 2 hours on a dirt road to the airstrip, which you only knew was somewhere down the road. There was only one road, which made it easy because it was just a matter of walking until you got there. The Lao didn't want to come. You didn't know why, because you couldn't speak their language and they had no English. You got to the airstrip carrying the foam cooler filled with Malayton blood on your shoulder, all alone, a very un-white man sort of thing to have done, because on colonial Malaya, you should have had a Malayton carrier carrying anything that needed carrying, perhaps carrying you on his back across any rivers you might encounter. Any Malaya man would assume you needed carrying, not just because that's what whites expected, but because you wouldn't want to get your big white man boots wet. But you were barefoot and entirely capable of wading across sluggish, slack-tide rivers, worrying only a little about whether under the brown water one or more crocodiles, puk-puk, might be lurking, waiting to snatch you and drown you, and stuff your dead white body in among the mangroves, and return to eat you a few days later when you were properly rotted, which is what a Solomon's book does after it takes you. Along the way, you found a Catholic mission and introduced yourself to the father in charge as an American scientist, not revealing that you were just a graduate student. And he fired up his generator and let you use his radio to to exceed the authority your leader had given you by chartering the light plane from Henderson Field back across Iron Bottom Sound, the same plane which you would have met with the cooler except for the missing Land Rover. The blood went into the Cessna's passenger seat, and you pushed your authority and chartered the plane to return each week on the same day, at the same time, to the same strip. Then you walked back to the beach where the Lao paddlers were waiting. You still couldn't talk to them, but the cooler was gone, and they understood that the plane had taken it. On the way back, the Lao stopped off at the Seventh-day Adventist mission, where the missionary gave you dinner and showed you what he proudly called his theological library: thin, shiny, stiff-backed books featuring a fair-skinned, light-haired Jesus playing with blonde children while bluebirds flitted, and you wondered if there was such a thing as a little golden book Bible or a little golden book encyclopedia of Christian theology, and decided that there was, and you were looking at it. The missionary wanted you to stay, but you had to get back to your artificial island in the Lao Lagoon because you knew your leader, your nominal chief, a man who would later die of testicular cancer, would be staying up and worrying about the blood. After Malaita, he lost one of his testicles in an operating room. The next time you did blood work with him, it was 2 years later and farther north in the Solomons, where you spoke the language well, and you told the people about his operation and that they could call him Kito Nabore, one nut. And you told him that Kito Nabore meant great man. And he believed you. When he died, you were ashamed about Kito Nabore, especially when you heard what one of the eulogists said of him, that some of the people he'd worked among had admired him so much that they called him great man. Later you realized that no matter how funny it seemed at the time, there had been some hostility involved. Probably because he had all but accused you of plagiarism when you were a first-year graduate student. You had written an excellent paper in which you cited 2 works written in Japanese. You had not thought to tell him in advance that you had enough Japanese to struggle through the Journal of the Japanese Obstetrical and Gynecological Society, which is why he called you into his office and hinted that you had cribbed the references and their contents. You were shocked and offended, but did not think you could display that in your first semester in graduate school, so you answered his questions politely. You thought he believed you when you said you could read Japanese, and he had to believe you when you passed a competency exam in Japanese, administered by another professor, an ex-Marine who, it was said, had been decorated for extreme cruelty during the Pacific War. Here in your dead mother's patch of vegetation, you're trying to hang on to the mystery of Harold K.K. and the 6 Anglican brothers. You can't think about it because you don't have enough information, so you're letting a phrase, a droning chant, run around in your mind. Harold K.K. killed 6 Anglican brothers. Why? 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 Harold K.K. killed 6 Anglican brothers. Why? 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 It's a mystery, so it makes a good chant. It's English, but that's all right too. It's becoming a strand, sometimes braiding itself with your other Guadalcanal and Malaita and Bougainville strands, and sometimes splitting itself off in the same way you're slashing and slicing the jungle you're in, sometimes pulling apart vines, sometimes gathering together the better for slashing. You don't want an empty mind, even though you're in a zone, even though you're doing Zen cutting and have become one with your machete. Thick growth everywhere. Your motor memory lets you pull handfuls of vines with your left hand as you slash with your right. Your hand is an inch from the sharp blade, but there's no danger because you remember how to do this, and by now you're doing it well. It's all coming together. Chant, strands, memories, vines, edge, action. When you slow for a little slack time, you hope that Harold KK killed the Anglican brothers quickly and didn't torture them. Thinking about executions makes you think about a tape recording you made 30 years ago, in which a Bougainville man named Messiamo tells you in his high-pitched, whispery voice how he killed starving Japanese soldiers. He tells you how he approached them one by one as they searched for food to steal from the native gardens, and offered to show them where the food was after he rested a bit. He would feign fatigue, a harmless fool bewildered by the fighting, and when the soldier relaxed and put aside his weapon, Messiamo would take out his concealed hatchet and kill him, take the soldier's weapon, and search his kit hoping for grenades, because in the little guerrilla army Messiamo raised, there was an excellent grenade thrower. Then he would drag the body into the bush and leave it. He was fast and strong, deadly, and he kept his people safe during the fighting. You're remembering how he finally allowed you to record his voice, having for months refused to be taped, which you thought might be for spiritual reasons. But finally he said it was because he didn't like to think that after he died, people might hear his voice and cry. You said nothing, but thought there were some whom his death would relieve, since he was still feared as a fighter and sorcerer who, with the war over and the Japanese gone, might find or even create new enemies. He never told you why he changed his mind about the taping, and you couldn't see how to ask him. You eventually came to love him. There's no other word for it. When you returned to that village 30 years later, in the dead of night as it happened, you shocked the young people who had come 100 miles down the coast from Buka with you. They told you this later, by veering off the trail and into the cemetery at Wapala, where you knew he had been buried, walking to where you knew his grave would have to be, and saying to him in his own tongue, Messiamo, I've returned. And you sobbed a few sobs at the sound of your voice, saying his name, speaking his language, but not so loudly that the young guys could hear over the shrill insects and the Wetu River. You knew they would be afraid to approach Messiamo's grave at night. Nobody ever asked you what you had done in the graveyard, but you knew them well enough to know it would be much talked about. In the tape, he's telling you how he saw the Japanese execute 2 Nagovisi, and you can be heard interrupting him to ask if they beheaded them, and he says, no, they shot them. They shot them suddenly, and the leaders gathered as witnesses were so shocked when Japanese handguns were quickly put to the heads of their friends and the triggers pulled, blowing the men's brains out onto the trunk of the coconut palm they'd been tied to, that they screamed and fell down. Some fainted. The blood and brains splattered on the trunk were washed away by the rain, but the 2 bullet holes stayed as warnings. After the Japanese defeat, the palm was felled and burned. You knew Messiamo betrayed one of the men to deflect suspicion from himself. He did not tell you what it felt like to witness the execution of someone he had betrayed to his enemy. In the clearing you've made, your feelings are as entangled as the aerial roots of the Monstera deliciosa you're grubbing out, though at least your tangles lead in the same direction. Have you betrayed your old puk-puk by working so well with your new one? You can feel the old one calling from upstate New York. Why did you leave me? You left it because August 2003 did not seem a good time to be packing a 23-inch machete on an airplane, even in your checked bag. And there's a kind of guilty pleasure that you've bonded so quickly with your new puk-puk, the rivets on its handle already a little shiny from your hand. You plan to carve your name into it, the way you did with your old one and with your castrating knife, but you'll do that later. You begin thinking about the overgrown pathway, the trail that leads from your old work to your new, from what you did with your old puk-puk to what you're doing with your new one. In the past, your work was more serious, because it generated food and shelter. But here in Hawaii, it's just making up for neglect, only landscaping. You remember that once, on Bougainville, you started to the other side of the island carrying your puk-puk as everyone always did. You didn't notice that the other men weren't carrying theirs. They stopped you and told you to take it back to your house and leave it, because although it was all right to carry it in Buin, a bushy town where women walked with their breasts exposed, in the white town, Orawa, or at the Panguna copper mine, it wasn't. In those places, whites got excited by the sight of men walking around with pukpuks swinging from their hands. You did what they said, but protested, "It's only a tool." And they told you yes, but whites don't understand bush tools. They think pukpuks are weapons. You could not have known, and neither could these men have known, that within 2 decades, pukpuks would be used as weapons, that spear guns of the kind you had seen in the Lau Lagoon would be launched at people instead of fish, that water pipes and scrap metal would be forged into shotguns, then discharged at soldiers who would return fire with automatic weapons, and that thousands of Bougainvilleans would die. You couldn't have known that, but the Bougainvilleans in your old village believed you had, that you had the gift of prophecy, that you had seen what would happen and had warned them. When you returned, you were told to your surprise and consternation that you had predicted the carnage, that it had unfolded as you said it would. You were stunned and asked in what manner you had predicted it. A young fighter quoted you, "Once you truly understand what the copper mine has done to you, there will be trouble." You did remember saying that, but to your mind, that was not the same as predicting a revolution, great destruction, and the deaths of 8,000 or 10,000 people, some of whom were your friends. And yet it had happened, and you were the one who foretold it. It was hard to know what to say, hard to know what to do back in your village, almost an old man now, uncomfortable being treated with restraint, perhaps even fear as a seer, uncomfortable with the deference shown an elder, uncomfortable having people you didn't recognize greet you saying, "Once, when I was little, I saw you." No one had ever treated you as an elder and prophet before, and you did not know how to behave appropriately given your new status. So you did as you'd done years before, chewed betel and ate sweet potato and taro and bananas, and attempted, but failed as always, to make the garden fire by friction. And you worked in your old garden dirt with your old garden partner, which gave you great pleasure. And one day you helped butcher a pig with the cheap Brazilian Tramontina machete you had been forced to buy because the store in Buca had no pukpuks. 2 years later in Hilo, part of your delight in finding the pukpuk was that it was hidden beneath a heap of Tramontinas on the shelf in the farmer's exchange. The pig would be eaten at a feast in your honor on the day you would formally announce the new school everybody already knew you were paying for. You had not been a rich American when you were there before, but you had money now, and you had brought 5,000 American dollars to give them. At the ceremony, you got to listen for the first time in your life. Here you were nearly 60 years old, listening to people making speeches about you. The speechmakers talked about your mother and how she raised you correctly and allowed you to come to them. And one speechmaker declared that although it was said you did not believe in God or Jesus Christ, this might not be true because you were behaving as a Christian should. But if it were true, then your goodness came from your mother. The young fighters you encountered were thoughtful revolutionaries rather than juiced-up young killers, so you returned safely. Later, you flew back across the Pacific to see your mother. You showed her a videotape of the speeches, and although profoundly deaf, she understood that speakers were praising her son because she could see you decorated and sitting among them, and the speechmakers turned to you often, and you shouted into her ear, "They're praising you, too." In the videotape, you're dressed nicely, heading a procession of villagers, preceded by a panpipe band, marshaled on one side by a man you had just learned had committed adultery with a woman you were in love with when you were her garden partner, and on the other side by a small woman, just a little older than you, who one day, long ago in the big bush, tempted you, prepared to betray her husband, the excellent grenade thrower. Before the procession, she decorated you with the wealth of her clan, your clan, traded up the Solomons into Bougainville decades, perhaps centuries before. And when she bent over towards you so she could slide the thickly coiled strands, some silky and polished from generations of handling, some new and rough, slide them over your head and onto your neck, you, the clanmate she had incestuously tried to seduce. You smelled her breath, peppery, her lips red from beetle. You looked into the one eye, merry as always, still inviting, and not into the black vacant socket of the other. You saw her breasts, now withered and lying flat against your chest, and you wished you had yielded to her. When it was your turn to speak, you asked that the school be named for your mother, who had been a teacher as you were a teacher, and as the villagers had been teachers to you long ago, when you were an unformed human being, too young to know very much. And then, because you had not been speaking their language for 30 years, you stumbled, and meaning to say, "You taught me to become a man," you said, "You taught me how to make babies." You tangled up the verbs to become and to create. And to your surprise, nobody laughed or mentioned it afterwards. You thought this might be a sign of respect, but more likely it was evidence that during the long, hot afternoon, the villagers tuned out of the speeches, if so, proving once again the psychic unity of humankind. Your mother's yard guy comes to mow the lawn, backing down the driveway in a giant pickup truck as if he owns the place. He steps down from his truck and sees you emerge from the jungle with a long machete in your hand, and you can tell that he's startled. You've never met. You've been paying him by mail, writing checks from your mother's checkbook, signing her name, because you've been avoiding the hassle of telling the bank that she's dead. You sense that to him, you don't belong here, so you don't wait for him to come to you. You go over to him, shake hands, talk a little, and then return to the jungle to cut bush with your machete. He gets on his riding mower and cuts the grass. When he's gone, having promised to return and haul away your cuttings because on the island of Hawaii in 2003, it's forbidden to burn yard trash, you're still cutting away, glorying in the power of motor memory. Your arm has remembered and remastered that slight pullback at the exact instant your wrist angles the blade when you're cutting a stem, and it goes ching, which to your hungry ear is a beautiful sound, the sound of a small thing perfectly done. Your wrist recovers the correct motion for cutting trees too small to axe, poke angling down, then twisted straight in. On your backstrokes, you never tangle the machete in the vines. Your breathing is regular and deep. Your heart rate is up, but steady, as if you were on a long run, completely in control of your effort. You have settled into a pace you know you can maintain for a long time. You're making nice moves on the small trees you're cutting, 20 or 30 of them. The trash tree your mother always called by its Latin name, Sestrum nocturnum, queen of the night, an exotic jasmine brought to Hawaii from the Central American tropics many years ago. As a boy, you were allergic to their flowers. Keeping them cut back so their night vapors wouldn't constrict your throat and make you wheeze was your job, because in the day you could fell them without incident. They have beautiful white berries, which are poisonous, and the flowers release an intoxicating scent that at night drifts into your mother's room where you've been sleeping. Sestrum nocturnum no longer makes you wheeze, but even so, you feel compelled to cut them down. Perhaps because your father is dead and your mother is dead, and this is now your own home and yard and trees, not just in a manner of speaking, but legally. And you can cut them down if you want to. You don't need a reason. You're getting used to the idea that this house, the one you grew up in, that it's your place and nobody else has any claim to it. And that the little patch you're clearing, queen of the night and all, is really yours, really. And now as you're getting to the end, you're remembering the last time you cleaned this place, when you came back from the Solomons with your first book, the one you could pack in your checked bag because it was 1974 and nobody in the Pacific worried about those things. Your mother asked you to cut everything back, and you did, feeling great satisfaction in transplanting what you had learned on one tropical isle to another. The Bougainvilleans also taught you the firecraft they needed to garden. So after you cut, you built a banked fire, and you dried out and reduced to ashes a giant heap of cuttings, even though it rained and they were sopping with it and their own juices. You kept the fire burning in the rain for 2 days, and your mother and father were impressed and praised you. But you shrugged off their praise, believing you had failed to reveal the heart of your book work and your firework, certain that it seemed to them a delightful parlor trick instead of a sightline into another way of life. And you couldn't bring yourself to lecture them, so you let it drop. Now there's no one left to show. You look down at your shoes. You've ruined the shoes you ran a marathon in last fall. Shoes you left in Hilo when your mother was dying, and you knew you'd be making trip and trip and trip again and didn't want to pack them each time. You left your marathon shoes here, and instead of running in them, you've been wearing them without socks in the mud and sap, trampling bleeding monstera, painted by the night queen's drizzling white. And your mother is dead, reduced to ashes, and you're still slashing, chopping, aiming always for the sweet sound of a clean stroke perfectly executed.